Let's wait a couple of minutes and see if more people come. Then we'll start. All right, let's get started. This is part 28 in our ongoing series on the fourth chapter of Bava Metzia, sorry. And we are continuing from what we started last week. Last week, we introduced the idea of ona'at divarim, which is ona'ah, or taking advantage of people using words, as opposed to what we had been talking about for months last spring, which was ona'at mamon, taking advantage of people using money, which generally speaking means overcharging somebody when you're selling something to them, or underpaying somebody when you're buying something from somebody. But we had defined ona'at divarim, the variety with words, last week as either reminding people of things they might have preferred to forget, reminding a Baal Tshuva of their sinful past, reminding a descendant of converts that their ancestors didn't used to be idolaters, suggesting that somebody who was a convert or a Baal Tshuva doesn't belong in a Torah learning context because their mouth has eaten non-kosher food and now shouldn't be used to form words of Torah. Those sorts of things, but also we had suggested some other, the Gemara had suggested some other socially nasty uses of speech, such as asking prices of things you have no intention of buying, sending somebody on a wild goose chase to buy something that they want to buy, but the person you send them to definitely doesn't sell, an assortment of other nastinesses of that sort, all using only words though, and not I guess actions or money. And so we're continuing on from there. This evening's Gemara is going to be more sort of philosophical and less legalistic. But let's get going. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, this is the same person who people tend to call Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. But in the Gemara, he's always ben Yochai. Bar Yochai doesn't appear until much later sources. suggesting that in his own life he was Shimon ben Yochai. So he said, Gadol an onad dvarim me onad mamon. The onad that you do with words is more serious, greater, bigger than the onad that you do with money. Seems likely that what he means is it's a more serious violation of the Torah. It is a worse thing to do, something of that sort. Because about ona'at devarim, about the ona'ah of words, it says, fear your God. And about this, it does not say, and fear your God. Now, last week, the last class, which was actually 2 weeks ago, we had seen a different interpretation of the absence of V'yareta me'elohecha about money, which there we had interpreted it as these words, fear your God, are associated with mitzvot that you can, that the only person who can know for sure whether the mitzvah is being violated is the person themselves, because there's something about the psychology of the violator that defines whether there's a crime happening or not. And so if that's the kind of mitzvah that gets fear your God, then fear your God would not necessarily mean that onad devarim is more serious or worse. It would just mean that onad devarim is defined by your intention in a way that ona'ah of money is not. And that if you cheat somebody out of money, you've committed the crime, whether you meant to or not. But it might be that being mean to people is only a crime if you meant to be mean to them. Or in the case that we saw 2 weeks ago, it's only a crime to ask a price of something when you don't have any money if you know that you're not planning to buy it and you don't have any money. And there's no way for someone else to know that. Like you, from the outside, you're thinking, I don't want that, but I think I'll waste the salesman's time, looks exactly the same as you're thinking, oh, I think I'll buy that. And then thinking to yourself, oh, darn, I really can't afford it. Never mind. Right. And there's no way for someone on the outside to tell the difference. And so if that's what fear your God is about, then that's not necessarily about severity. But Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai seems to think that the problem is that, or the difference is that God actually is more upset about you using words to take advantage of people than about you using money. Okay. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Zeb Gufo v'Zeb Mamono. Rabbi Elazar says, I agree with you that the ona'ah of words is worse than the ona'ah of money, but I think it's for a different reason. I think that it is worse to attack the person than it is to attack the person's stuff. And attacking, even psychologically, not physically, but attacking the person themselves is worse. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar, ze nitan lehishavon, ze lo nitan lehishavon. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani has a different reason. He also agrees that the ona'ah of words is worse, but he has a different reason why. He says, well, if I take your money when I shouldn't, I could just give it back to you. But if I hurt your feelings or I waste your time, that's not repayable. There's nothing I can do to fix it. And that makes it worse. Tani Tana Kamei Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So a Tana recited a Braita in front of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. And this is not the kind of Tana who is a person quoted in a Mishnah or a Braita. This is the other meaning of the word Tana, which is a sort of human library, whose job it is to memorize and then recite Torah Sheba'al Peh in the Beit Midrash. And it recited the following Braita. The text is, anybody who whitens the face of his friend or his fellow in public, it is as if he spilled blood, as if he committed murder. Now, this is a little bit problematic because it seems to mean to embarrass somebody, and it is not just us who might respond by saying, hey, wait a minute, when I get embarrassed, I don't get pale, I get flushed. That actually for 1,000 years, people have been writing commentaries to that effect. Nobody's quite sure what's going on with this, but we're just going to go with it. It would seem that they have a phenomenon in which people go pale when they get embarrassed. either before they turn pink or after they've turned pink, not clear. But somehow that is what that's the term for embarrassing somebody is whitening their face. Amrle, so Rav Nachman says to the Tana, Shapir Kamarta, he said, you said it really well. De chazina le de azil sumka v'ati chifra. Because in fact, if somebody comes in to the conversation with a pink face and they go away with a pale face, then describing the person who made that happen as spilling blood seems to me accurate. You took the blood that was supposed to be in their face and you moved it somewhere else. You took their blood away from them, which is shedding blood super super literally. It seems like it may be that the original intent of the text was to compare, just to say it's as bad as murder, not necessarily to say that it's literally moving people's blood around, but okay. All right. Amalei Abaye Rav Dimi. So Abaye asked Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi is one of the characters who travels back and forth between Babylonia and the land of Israel. So his role is to bring news about Torah as it's being learned in the land of Israel to Babylonia. So Abaye asked him, B'marava b'mai zahiri. Abaye asked him, what mitzvah are they especially careful about in Israel, which is the West? If you're standing in Iraq, you are to the east of Israel, so you would describe Israel as being the West. Amrle b'achveri ape. So Rav Dimi tells Abaye the thing that they're particularly careful about in Israel is about not embarrassing people, not whitening faces. The Amar of Rabbi Chanina, because Rabbi Chanina said, Hakol yordim legehinom chutz mishlosha. Rabbi Chanina said everyone goes down to Gehinom except for 3. Gehinom is not exactly the same thing as hell, but for our purposes here, it's approximately that. It seems to be some sort of temporary-ish punishment after one dies, except it's not temporary for everybody. And that's as much detail as I understand about what's going on here. So we're gonna have to deal with that level of detail. In any case, what Rabbi Chanina said doesn't seem to make any sense, right? Everybody goes to Gehinom except for 3 people seems unlikely, especially since their memory of the quote is that the 3 people are bad people. So Hakol Sagadata, could you really think that you've memorized that right and that it's supposed to say everyone goes down to Gehinom? No, that's got to be wrong. Ela ema hakol yordim legehinom, kol hayordim legehinom olim chutz mishlosha. In fact, the quote must have been everybody who goes down to Gehinom comes back up again, except for 3. And presumably this is 3 kinds of people, not 3 individuals. Sheyordim va'ein olim. These 3 go down, but they don't come up. Ve'eluhain, habal eshet ish. And these are they, a man who sleeps with a woman who's married to another man. Ve'hamalbim pnei chavero barabim, and somebody who humiliates their fellow in public. Ve'mechaneh et shem ra lechavero, and somebody who gives a bad nickname to their fellow. And this is Gemara, and later on the halachic decisors take very, very seriously the idea that you should not give someone a nickname that either the other person does not want or that is objectively bad. And this is not something which our culture necessarily thinks of as the worst crime in the universe, but it is, in fact, clearly here considered to be a really dastardly thing to do. But they have a problem with it because mechaneh hainu malbin. Isn't giving somebody a bad nickname the same thing as humiliating somebody else? Maybe it should just be a special case of embarrassing people. So they say, no, it must be that there are cases of calling somebody by a nasty nickname that are actually not embarrassing but are still criminal. Avagav de dash baby shmei. Even if everybody is used to this nickname, it is, and the person is no longer embarrassed by it because everybody just sort of, ignores it because it happens all the time. Nonetheless, it is still considered giving the person a bad nickname, and you still should not do it. I think that it seems to me likely that if the other person actually wants you to call them by that name, like it's then that is different, but you have to be very careful with that. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Noach lo la'adam she'yavo al safek eshet ish v'yalbin pnei chaviro b'Rabbi. Rabbi Bar Chana said then in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it's better for a man to sleep with a woman who might be married than it is to definitely humiliate somebody else in public. Okay, now that's a strange choice to have to make. But we're going to have a story in which we're going to be comparing people who've done these two things. No. So how do we know that this one is better than the other? Darash Rava, because of this thing that Rava interpreted. And you have to know here that not only does the Gemara assume that almost all of the book of Psalms, the book of Tehillim, was written by King David, but they also assume that bits that seem to refer to reality in the surroundings of the poet are talking about the reality of King David's life, and generally speaking, that they're talking about things in King David's life that we can identify with stuff that we have in the other narratives we have about David. Okay, so Tehillim 35, Lamed Hey, is one of the chapters of Tehillim in which it would appear that the psalmist, will call him here David for it to stay in consonance with the Gemara, is complaining about being mistreated by crowds of other people. And we have here not even a complete quote of this verse. As you can see, there's a chunk missing in the middle. So let me open my Tanakh and read you the whole verse. We're in chapter 35, verse 15. And it reads like this. Uvitzali samchu, when I was limping, they celebrated. Vinesfu, and they gathered. Neesfu alai nechim, they gathered around me. And they gathered around me hitting velo yadati, and I didn't know. Karu velo damu, they tore, and the end, ordinarily I would translate this as they did not stop, or they were not silent. But the shoresh could also mean they didn't do something having to do with blood, right? Damam, dalad mem mem, does mean to be quiet, which is how I would have translated it. But it would seem that here the Rava is going to interpret it as they didn't bleed, or I didn't bleed. So it sounds like we have some sort of group attack on an injured person who, in the end, when they're injured, they don't bleed. Okay, so Rava says that what this means is Amar Davi lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. King David said to God, Ribono shel olam, galui v'yadua lefanecha, she'im hayu mekarim b'sari lo haya dami shotet la'aretz. David says to God, Master of the universe, you know that even if they would tear my flesh, I wouldn't bleed. My blood wouldn't drip to the ground. Rashi said this is because he's been fasting so much, because he's been doing tshuva. Right? Just to remember the background quickly, David is home during the summer during the fighting season, not entirely clear why he's home, but in any case, he's walking around on the palace upper level, and he looks out and he sees this woman bathing on her roof, and he sends his lackeys to go retrieve her. There's no indication that he asks for consent, much less that she would have been capable of giving it, so we'll call it he rapes her, and he sends her home, and she sends a message a couple weeks later, I'm pregnant, now what should I do? So he summons her husband, Uriah Hachiti, home from the battlefront, and tries to send Uriah home to spend the night with his wife. Uriah refuses to go home and sleeps on the floor in the hallway of the palace because he says that while his soldiers are sleeping in the mud at the battlefront, he's not going home to sleep in his bed with his wife. So that David, not having been able to pass the baby off as Uriah's, decides instead he has to get rid of Uriah so he can marry Bathsheba. So he sends Uriah back to the battlefront with a sealed message for the general, Yoav, that says, send this man to the front of the battle and then withdraw the other troops and leave him there until he gets killed. Effectively, he orders them to arrange for him to die in battle. The Uriah dies. Then Natan Hanavi comes to David and says, again, tells him this whole parable, which in the end results in David declaring worthy of death the character in the parable who is supposed to be him. Natan says, well, that's you. David says, I have sinned against God. And he sits on the floor and he fasts and whatever. The baby is born. The baby is very ill. David sits Shiva until the baby dies and then gets up again. It's this very, very strange reverse situation. David and Bathsheba get married. She gets pregnant again. She has Shlomo. Okay, that's the story as it appears in the text. We're introducing this extra piece. It's not clear how much later this happens, but it sounds like in Malachim Aleph, when David is on his deathbed and Shlomo is 12, so that's somewhat later. It sounds like in a conversation between Bathsheba and David there, it sounds like there's still plenty of palace gossip and she's still definitely not being treated like an equal citizen in the palace. So it doesn't really matter how much later this is. It seems like this follows David around socially for the rest of his life. In any case, apparently he's been fasting and doing tshuva so much that he no longer bleeds when he gets cut. That seems like an extreme thing, but not my specialty. His velood ela afilu b'sha'ashos kim b'negayim ve'olot omrimi. It is not only that, but when we're learning negayim and olot, which are famously very difficult topics and also have absolutely nothing to do with adultery, they interrupt me and they say, David, habal eshet ish mitato b'ma. And somebody raises their hand in the back of the classroom and they say, hey, David, what's the death penalty for an adulterer? And I tell them, mitato b'chenek. The adulterer gets strangulation, but he goes to the world to come. But somebody who humiliates their fellow in public has no share in the world to come. Okay, so it seems like the message put into David's voice here in this midrash that Rava is saying is that it is in fact worse to humiliate people than it is to commit adultery, and it sounds actually in what David's saying like it's worse even to commit to humiliate people than to commit adultery for sure. But Rava put it as maybe, which let's take a second to explain that. The Gemara, not here, but elsewhere, I think in a number of other places, but definitely somewhere else, claims that David's soldiers had a practice of giving their wives a conditional divorce when they went away to battle, in order to prevent there from being an aguna problem if the body of a dead soldier was lost or if a soldier was taken captive and was never able to come back again, so that the divorce was conditional. If I come back within a year, we're still married. If I'm not here within a year, this divorce is valid as of today. So anybody who is married to a soldier in David's army who is at the battlefield is sort of definitionally their Schrodinger's wife. It's not possible to know whether they're married at the moment because it depends on something that hasn't happened yet. If their husband shows up again, then they will turn out to have been married the whole time. If their husband doesn't show up again, they will turn out to have been divorced from before the war started. And in Bathsheba's case, in fact, her husband never comes home. So, in fact, it turns out that David didn't commit adultery because she wasn't married. Of course, the text in Shmuel Bet not only is very, very clear that David confesses to a sin, but it's also clear that God thinks that David sinned and also calls Bathsheba the wife of Uriah the Hittite for the rest of her life, including the whole time she's married to David. So, like maybe we can get David off on a technicality here, but morally it doesn't seem to change things. Okay, in any case, moving along. Amar Marzutra Bar Tuvia Amar Rav. Marzutra said in the name of Rav, except maybe it's not, right? The tradition seems to have been corrupted here, and we're not exactly sure who said this. The Amrila Amar of Chana Bar Bizna Amar of Shimon Chasida, or maybe it was Rav Chana Bar Bizna in the name of Shimon Chasida. The Amrila Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amar of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, or maybe it was Rabbi Yochanan speaking in the name of Shimon ben Yochai. Noach lo la'adam she'apil atzmo lekivshan ha'esh v'al yalbin pnei chaviro b'rabi. It's better to throw yourself into a fiery furnace than to humiliate someone in public. Minalan. So how do we know that? Mitamar dichtiv hi mutzet v'hi shalcha el chamia. Because it says she was being taken out and she sent a message to her father-in-law. Now, the story here, just very, very briefly, is that Tamar was originally married to Yehuda's oldest son, Er, who God didn't like. God found him to be evil, so God killed him. So Yehuda tells his second son, Onan, to do Yibum with Tamar. And Onan goes to marry Tamar, and knowing that the child will not really be considered his, it'll really be considered his brother's, he refuses to have a child with her. So God kills him too. But of course, Yehuda doesn't know that God's the one killing his children. He just sees that anybody who goes and marries Tamar ends up dead. So he tells Tamar, well, you're going to have to marry the third son, but he's not old enough yet. I'll call you, don't call me. And Tamar goes home to live in her father's house. She sees that Shelah, the third son, is all grown up and that she's not being summoned to marry him. And she, it seems legitimately in the eyes of the text, thinks that she has a right to a husband and a child from this family. So when she hears that Yehuda's wife, the mother of these three sons, has died, she goes and she poses as a prostitute at a street corner where she knows Yehuda is going to be walking past. She propositions him, or he propositions her actually, and she demands from him, he's on his way to shear sheep, and she demands a goat from him as payment. So he doesn't have any goats, he only has sheep. So he leaves his staff and his seal with her to hold on to until he sends the goat. She, of course, disappears with his staff and seal and pregnant with his baby, so that he's unable to pay his goat. And then, of course, when a message gets to Yehuda, your daughter-in-law is pregnant, he says, take her out and burn her, without so much as inquiring what might have happened. And as she's being taken out to be burned, she sends the staff and the seal to him with a note that says something like, by the way, the father of my child is the owner of these objects. And he looks at it and says, she's more innocent than I am, don't kill her. And she gives birth to the twins, Peretz and Zerach. Peretz is David's, I forget how many great-great-great-grandfather. That might not be the right number of generations, but it's the right relationship. In any case, what Tamar does not do is announce to the world, Yehuda is the father of this baby, and the reason why I had to entrap him is because he was planning to leave me as an agunah forever, because he was afraid that something bad would happen to his son. Instead, she offers him the opportunity to confess, but she seems to be prepared to die if he doesn't decide to confess. So we are interpreting from that it's better to die than it is to embarrass somebody, even it seems if the other person really deserves it, right? Like in this case, there would have been nothing bad at all about telling the truth. It would certainly have embarrassed him, but it would also have been true, and it would also have been, I think, her legal right to say what happened. And nonetheless, we seem to be applauding her for deciding to die rather than defend herself. I wouldn't take this particularly literally as a legal text. let's leave this in its biblical context and assume that that's where it's meant to stay. Do not try this at home. Okay. Amar Rav Chinana Breder of Edi, my dichtiv lo tonu isha tamito. So Rav Chinana Breder of Edi wants to know, what is this the verse we learned about not doing ona'av words from to begin with. He says, what does this text mean? Right? Don't oppress. A person should not oppress his amit, his which usually it's translated as his fellow, but literally it means the one who is with him. So Rav Chinana says it means am she'itcha b'Torah u'v'mitzvot al tonehu. People who are with you in Torah and mitzvot, those people you should not do ona'ah to. Right? So that seems to really limit the scope. Right? Anybody whose Torah observance you completely approve of, those people you should be nice to. I don't try this at home either, honestly. Amarav, Leolami He'adam Zahir Ba'onat Ishto Shemito Shedimata Mitsuya Onata Krova. So Rav says a person, and here he seems to mean a man, should always be careful with the ona'ah of his wife, the oppression of his wife, because since her tears are common, her tears are present, it seems to mean women cry more frequently or more easily than men. Her oppression is close. It seems to mean it's really easy to psychologically abuse women. So you have to be really careful that you don't. That seems to be the content of this this instruction. Which in the world of things that people who are prejudiced against women say, I guess that's less objectionable than most. But that's the nicest thing I have to say about it. Rabbi Elazar, miyom shenachrav beit hamikdash ninalu sharei tfilas. Rabbi Elazar says, sort of on the note of people crying and it not being a good idea to make people cry, he says, from the time that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, the gates of prayer have been locked. Presumably that means that if you pray, God doesn't listen. Or God, maybe you can't hear because, there's a locked gate between you and God. Shneamar, Gam ki ez akva ashavea satam tfilati. As it says in Eicha, even when I pray, my prayer is sealed up. Now, plausibly, the poet in Eicha might have meant to say, I'm trying to pray, but nothing comes out of my mouth, rather than I pray, but my prayer gets blocked by a locked gate. But okay, whatever. But Rabbi Elazar says, even though God doesn't listen to prayers anymore, he still listens to tears. Right? So this is connected to the Rav statement, probably in that it's saying it's really not a good idea to make your wife cry, because if you make your wife cry, God will listen to your wife, not you, and you'll get punished. Presumably the same thing is true if you make your husband cry. Okay, and we will be meeting this idea of the gates of prayer being locked and the gates of tears not being locked later, next week or the week after. And when we do meet it again, the person crying will be male. And the person thinking clearly will be his wife. So we're definitely going to flip the script there. We just haven't yet. Shneimar. So here's our pasuk that the gates of tears are not locked. Shim'at tfilati Hashem. God listened to my prayer. Shavati ha'azina, and listened to my plea. El dimati al techarash. Don't make yourself deaf to my tears, which is, it sounds to me like the author of Tehillim is asking God to listen to both the prayer and the tears, but also, if we're going to date Tehillim as being David, that's before the first Beit HaMikdash is built, but whatever. It might be stronger about God hearing tears than God hearing prayers. That's the best I can do. But here we have a problem, because Rav is the one who just told us that it's really important to make sure you're not mean to your wife. Okay, The Amar Rav, and Rav also said, Kol ha'olech ba'atzat ishto nofel begihinom. Anybody who listens to his wife's advice falls into Gehinom. Shneamar rak lo haya ka'achav, etc. This is a verse which is in the narration right after Eliyahu's final threat to Achav and Izebel about how they're going to die horribly because they're pretty terrible people, but also they brought idolatry to the land. And Achav there is described as the man most influenced by his wife to commit idolatry in history, which is certainly a complaint that Izebel influenced Achav. It's hard to pretend that it means that women in general are bad for their husbands, but Rav seems to have read it that way. And so that we seem to have this confusion about exactly what Rav's instructions are about your relationship with your wife. You should always be nice to her, but never follow her advice. Seems like a very strange combination. I'm really Rav Papa la Abaye. So Rav Papa said to Abaye, "Veha amri inshi itatach gutza gachim v'tilchoshla." Rav Papa says, Abaye, also we have this folk saying, if your wife is short, bend down and whisper to her, which seems to be about overcoming physical differences between men and women to have a good communication anyway. But for sure it seems to indicate that you're supposed to have a conversation with your wife. So which is it? Are you supposed to talk to your wife, or you're not supposed to talk to your wife? Lo kasha, haba mili de alma, haba mili de beta. So that we first suggest it's not a problem. One is about general conversation, and the other is about specific things having to do with the household. Presumably that means you do talk to your wife about the household and you don't talk to her about anything else. Or lishna achrina, alternatively, haba mili de shmaya, haba mili de alma. Maybe one is about religious issues. Don't talk to your wife about religion. Do talk to your wife about general world. I would say that we have greatly improved the world by offering women religious education so that this is no longer a thing. And we could, I think, leave it just with that. So Rav Chista gives us a slightly different version of this idea that you can't pray, but you can cry. He says all of the gates are locked except for the gates of ona'ah. So potentially that means that the only people that God listens to are people who are victims of ona'ah with words. We will come back around to that too. So keep that in mind. But his proof text is Shne'emar, Hine Hashem nitzav al chomat anach uviado anach. So this one seems to be a pun. Here Amos is shown a vision of God standing on a very vertical wall that was made with a plumb line, and in God's hand is a plumb line. But the term for plumb line is anach, which seems to be reminiscent of the word ona'ah. And so it seems like God is personally involved in the straightening out of crooked things and the punishing of people who oppress other people with speech. That seems to be the message. Amar Rabbi Elazar kol hanifra b'yidei shaliach chutz me'ona'ah shne'emar v'yado anach. So Rabbi Elazar says, well, I like your verse, Rav Chista, but I have a different thing to say about ona'ah using it. I think that it indicates that God is, as I said, personally involved in things that relate to ona'ah. So God punishes all other crimes through a messenger, but God is going to personally come get you if you're guilty of ona'ah. Amar Rabbi Abahu, Shlosha ein hapargod ninal b'fneihem. Rabbi Abahu said there are three kinds of crimes that the screen is not locked in front of them. Rashi says this is the kind of like a privacy screen that you have in the court of a king that prevents people from seeing the king's face. I imagine that takes different forms in different kingdoms. And I have no idea what the God's metaphorical privacy screen would be. But it's metaphor. So in any case, the three things that can get right through to talk to God are ona'ah. Presumably we mean ona'ah of words here because of the context, but it doesn't specifically say that. And gezel, theft, and avodah zarah, idolatry. Though it seems like those three things get right past all the palace guards, and God knows about them personally right away, and then presumably we are in agreement with Rabbi Elazar that God then punishes them personally. Ona'ah dichtiv uvyado anach. So the proof text for ona'ah is the same as before, the verse from Yoel, that God is holding the plumb line in his own, so to speak, hand. Gezel dichtiv chamas v'shod yishama ba al panai tamid. All right, in Yirmiyah has a verse critiquing Jerusalem as having violence and devastation heard in Jerusalem all the time, but it says that they're heard before me. So it seems like God is, listening to testimony about violence all the time, and violence in the rabbinic literature is always associated with violent theft. They always, whenever the word Hamas appears, the rabbis imagine this not as violent, pointless violence, but as like a mugging, right? You beat somebody up and take their stuff. So that's theft. And avodah zarah dichtiv, the idolatry, the proof text is Am machisinoti al panai tamid. This is a verse in Yeshayahu where in fact it didn't quote the important part. The end of the verse, right? The verse is that the piece they quoted is the people are constantly angering me in front of me. And the end of the verse is they sacrifice in gardens and burn sacrifices on bricks. That seems to be that what they're doing that's angering God, which is in front of him constantly, which seems to indicate God is personally taking an interest, is the people are sacrificing in places they're not supposed to sacrifice. It's not entirely clear to me that that has to have been idolatry in the original and not just sacrifice in the wrong place, but we seem to be taking it as idolatry here. All right, we have a lot of this has been setting us up for a story that we're going to have starting in another half page or so of Gemara, which is going to pick up on a lot of these themes, and it's even going to pick up some of these people. But it was a bit of a jumble of ideas this evening. In any case, are there questions?
About the white face expression. Yes. Yeah, I was thinking that there is the English expression of the blood drained from his face. So we do have a similar concept. It's just under somewhat different circumstances. But
yeah,
maybe in those days, it was not just embarrassment; it was fear when that of what people might do when they heard what people were saying about him.
It certainly could be, and it's also possible, although I am certainly no expert on the subject, that some of these things, exactly which emotion causes which physiological response, can be culturally bound. I don't actually know if that's true or not, but it's not totally impossible that we actually respond to embarrassment differently because our culture treats it differently. I don't know. But I do know that people have been confused by it for a long time. All right. I will see you next week. I think we have something like 2 or 3 classes left from this chapter, which will get us to sometime during the Chagim. And then I will have to choose something new to do starting after Sukkot. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.